Well, let me just ask you a really simple question. A lot of people think it's unbecoming for a preacher to live a life of luxury and to fly around in private jets. What's your response to that?
They're wrong.
Do you really believe that human beings are demons?
No, I do not. And don't you ever say I did.
And you have some fancy clothes. I mean, for a pastor, you are living a life of luxury. You've got great homes, you've got great planes, you drive in limos.
I'm a very wealthy man.
You're a very wealthy man.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kenneth Copeland is one of the darkest individuals I've ever come across.
I think he started with good intentions, but I think power and money went to his head.
And how is a pastor worth nearly $1 billion?
Now, where's that badge, just by the way? Off the property. You want to see this? Off the property. Look, you can see a flash your gun.
In that magnificent name, the name of Jesus, amen.
$760 million. That is the number attached to one of the most powerful and controversial preachers in America, Kenneth Copeland. For decades, he has stood in front of millions of people and preached a message that sounds simple: believe, have faith, and prosper. But somewhere along the way, the preacher became associated with a fortune estimated at $760 million. And that raises a question that is almost impossible to ignore. How does a pastor become worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Because Kenneth Copeland doesn't live like an ordinary preacher. He has a massive ministry empire. He has lived in an extraordinary lakefront mansion. He has his own airport. And then there are the private jets. One of them was a Gulfstream 5 that Copeland acquired from Hollywood filmmaker Tyler Perry. And when a journalist once confronted him about his private aircraft, Copeland didn't simply say that he liked flying private. He gave a very different explanation. He said it was necessary for his ministry. But that's only the beginning. Because behind the mansion, behind the aircraft, behind the television broadcasts, behind the donations, behind the books, and behind the millions of people who listen to his message, there is a financial empire that has been building for decades. And the deeper you go into that empire, the stranger the story becomes.
May I add something to that? My wealth doesn't come from offerings alone.
Because some of the most valuable properties connected to Copeland's ministry aren't simply ordinary church buildings. His organization has controlled enormous amounts of property in Texas. His church has operated aircraft worth millions of dollars, and his famous residence, owned by the ministry, has been valued in the millions. So where did all of this wealth come from? How did a former musician become one of America's most famous prosperity preachers? How did his message about financial blessing become connected to an organization worth millions? And what exactly is hiding behind that $760 million number? Because this isn't simply a story about a rich pastor. It's the story of faith, money, television, real estate, private aviation, and one of the most extraordinary religious fortunes America has ever seen. And to understand the fortune, we have to go back to the very beginning, before the mansion, before the jets, before the millions, before Kenneth Copeland became Kenneth Copeland. Kenneth Copeland was born in Lubbock, Texas in 1936 and grew up in West Texas near an airfield. For most children, living near an airfield might have been nothing more than a curiosity. For Copeland, it became an obsession. He wanted to fly. But there was another dream developing at the same time: music. And in the 1950s, that dream actually started working, not in a church, not behind a pulpit, on the radio, on record. In 1957, Copeland, and then performing professionally as Ken Copeland, released a song called Pledge of Love. And something happened that would sound almost impossible if you only knew him as a preacher. The song became a genuine national hit. Billboard records show Pledge of Love climbing the charts that year. It eventually reached the top 40, giving the young Ken Copeland a taste of something most aspiring musicians never experience: national attention. For a moment, his future seemed to be pointing somewhere completely different. He could have become a their hit. He could have built an entertainment career. But then his life took a turn, and it wasn't a small turn. It would completely change the direction of his life. Copeland's own ministry history describes a spiritual transformation in the early 1960s, followed by a growing conviction that he was supposed to enter ministry. And eventually, the man who had once been trying to make it in music began pursuing something him. Because Copeland didn't simply walk away from everything he had learned, he carried something with him. His fascination with aviation, his experience in entertainment, his understanding of broadcasting, and eventually, his understanding of how powerful a message could become when it reached people through mass media. In 1966, according to Kenneth Copeland Ministries' own history, Kenneth and Gloria Copeland began their journey toward ministry and moved toward Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Kenneth would attend Oral Roberts University. And this is where one of the most important relationships in Copeland's life began. Oral Roberts, C. Dent, his background as a pilot suddenly became extremely valuable. He became associated with Roberts as a pilot and chauffeur, gaining first-hand exposure to large-scale evangelism and healing ministry. Was now seeing the power of a completely different kind of public platform. And a man who was still learning what his own ministry would become was watching someone who had already built one. But there was another influence entering the picture. Kenneth E. Hagin. Copeland and Gloria attended faith seminars associated with Hagin, and those teachings became deeply influential in the development of the Copeland's ministry philosophy. And slowly, the pieces began coming together. Faith, healing, broadcasting, giving, prosperity could affect not only a person's spiritual life, but their life here on earth.
I had to learn this, like I said, from the Bible and from my spiritual mentor, Oral Roberts. And I learned it from him, working with him, and then he was close friends until he died.
This would eventually become one of the defining themes of Copeland's ministry. His organization today describes its mission in terms of faith, divine healing, biblical prosperity, and the application of Scripture to everyday life. But in the beginning, there was no giant organization, no huge property, no famous airport, no fleet of aircraft to steam it. There was simply a couple, a calling, and a decision to start. In 1967, Kenneth and Gloria Copeland established what became Kenneth Copeland Ministries, and according to the ministry's own historical account, the operation began on a dramatically smaller scale than the organization people would know decades later. That is the part of this story that is easy to overlook, because when you see the finished empire, it appeared overnight. It didn't. It started with a message, then came meetings, then publications, then radio, then television, and eventually, the message began reaching people far beyond the room where Copeland was standing. In the early 1970s, the ministry began experimenting with television programming, the Word of Faith, then the Prayer Group, and eventually Believer's Voice of Victory. What began as relatively small broadcasts would become a major part of the Copeland media operation. And this is where the story starts to change. Because a preacher with a small audience is one thing. A preacher with dia is something completely different. Television doesn't require you to preach to 100 people, or 1,000, or even 10,000. The same message can be transmitted into thousands of homes, then millions, again and again. And every broadcast can introduce the ministry to another potential supporter, another viewer, another reader, another believer, another person willing to become a partner. This wasn't just preaching anymore, it was the beginning of a media machine. And Copeland understood something extremely important. If the message could travel, the ministry could grow. The audience could grow, the reach could grow, and eventually the money flowing through the organization could grow with it. But there was something Copeland would need before the empire could become enormous. A philosophy powerful enough to make people believe that prosperity wasn't something to feel guilty about. And this is where the story takes another turn. Because Kenneth Copeland wasn't simply preaching that people should have faith. He was teaching a much bigger idea, that faith could change the circumstances of your life, that prosperity could be part of God's plan. And that belief would eventually become one of the most powerful and controversial ideas in his entire career. Because once you understand what Kenneth Copeland believed about prosperity, you begin to understand how the empire was built. And that's where the story gets much more interesting, because the next question isn't, how did Kenneth Copeland become rich? The next question is, what exactly was he teaching people about money? And once that message reached television, everything changed.
Do you think the Jewish people believe you should be broke?
Are you saying that Jewish people appreciate money more than... Really?
They believe in wealth.
Some people would find that offensive.
No, wait a minute now. I'm not talking about some people.
There is a reason the story of Kenneth Copeland's fortune cannot be separated from one word: prosperity. Because Copeland wasn't simply telling people to have faith. He was teaching them to think differently about money itself. And once you understand that message, you begin to understand the machine behind the ministry. According to Kenneth Copeland Ministries, the organization teaches what it calls biblical prosperity. Its mission explicitly includes faith, divine healing, and biblical prosperity. But what exactly does that mean? To understand it, forget the mansion for a moment. Forget the airplanes. Forget the $760 million estimate. Go back to the beginning. Imagine someone sitting at home, struggling financially, looking at a pile of bills, wondering how they're ever going to get ahead. Then they turn on the television, and instead of hearing that wealth is automatically sinful, they hear something completely different. Prosperity can be part of God's plan. Copeland's teachings have repeatedly connected faith, giving, and receiving. In one Kenneth Copeland Ministries explanation of its law of giving and receiving, the ministry says that faith combined with giving produces a harvest of prosperity. And that idea becomes extremely important. Because now money isn't simply money, it becomes seed. You plant, you believe, you wait, and you expect a harvest. Copeland Ministries uses this exact agricultural metaphor in its teaching. A seed goes into the ground and eventually produces something much larger than the original seed. The ministry applies that concept to faith, prosperity, health, and other areas of life. And then comes the part that made the message especially powerful: giving.
Pastors were basically telling us that the more you give to the church, the more God will give to you.
The ministry teaches that giving is connected to receiving. One of its teachings on prosperity explicitly describes giving and receiving as part of a spiritual law and discusses the expectation of a financial return. Think about how different that sounds from the way most people normally think about money. If you have $100, the ordinary instinct is to hold on to it. You need food, you have rent, you have bills, you have responsibilities, but the prosperity message introduces another possibility. What if giving isn't simply losing money? What if giving is planting? And what if the harvest is supposed to be greater than the seed? That idea can be incredibly powerful, especially when it is connected to faith. Because now the person giving isn't necessarily thinking, I'm losing $100. They may be thinking, I'm planting $100. And that distinction matters. Because once a financial contribution becomes spiritually meaningful, it becomes much more than a transaction. It becomes an act of faith. And Kenneth Copeland Ministries has built a huge amount of its teaching around that relationship between faith, giving, and prosperity. The ministry even teaches that tithing is distinct from additional giving and describes a tithe as 10% of gross income. But there is something else happening here. The message doesn't simply tell people, give. It tells them to believe, to speak, to expect, to keep going, to trust that the harvest will eventually come. And that creates a psychological cycle. Faith leads to action. Action leads to giving. Giving reinforces the belief. And the expectation of a future harvest encourages continued faith. That cycle can become extremely powerful. But there is an important distinction. Kenneth Copeland Ministries itself says that giving money does not automatically create prosperity or healing. It says the person's faith and relationship with God are central to the process. So this wasn't simply give money and get rich. The teaching was more sophisticated than that. It was in an entire worldview. A worldview in which God could prosper people, faith could produce results, giving could be understood as sowing, and prosperity could be viewed as something that could serve a larger purpose. Copeland has also argued that prosperity should not simply be about luxury for its own sake. In one of his teachings, he says prosperity is connected to establishing God's covenant and helping meet the needs of others. And this is important for understanding how Copeland himself has defended the philosophy. Because critics can look at the wealth surrounding the ministry and ask, why does a preacher need this much? But Copeland's answer has never simply been, because I want to be rich. His theological argument is that prosperity can provide resources for ministry. More resources, more reach, more giving, more missions, more broadcasting, more influence. And now the entire system begins to make sense, because if the message reaches more people, the ministry can attract more supporters. If more supporters participate, the ministry has more resources. Those resources can fund television. Television reaches more people. More people hear the message, and the cycle continues. Message, audience, partners, resources, more reach, then repeat. And this is where television became incredibly important, because Kenneth Copeland wasn't building a local church that depended only on the people sitting in one building every Sunday. He was building something that could cross state lines, then national borders. A message could be recorded once and broadcast into thousands of homes. A magazine could be printed and mailed to supporters. A teaching could be recorded and distributed again and again. The ministry could communicate with people who had never even visited Texas. And that meant the size of the ministry no longer had to be limited by the size of a room. That was the breakthrough. The room became the television. And the television could become the world. By the time the Copeland Ministry had established a major broadcasting operation, the preacher who once needed an audience in front of him could now speak to people across the country and eventually around the world. And here's where our story takes another major turn, because a ministry built around prosperity needed something else to survive, people willing to keep supporting it. And Kenneth Copeland had a strategy for creating something much more powerful than a one-time donation. He wanted partners, people who didn't simply watch, people who didn't simply listen, people who became financially connected to the ministry. And once that partnership model began expanding, the little ministry that started decades earlier was no longer so little. It was becoming an organization, then a media operation, then a property owner, then an aviation operation, then an empire. And eventually, people would look at everything surrounding Kenneth Copeland and ask the question that brings us back to that number on the thumbnail. How did all of this become associated with $760 million? But before we can answer that, we have to follow the money one step at a time, because the next part of the story isn't about what Copeland preached. It's about how the ministry turned that message into a system capable of reaching millions of people. And that system would eventually become the foundation of the fortune everyone wanted to understand. Kenneth Copeland had discovered something that would change the scale of his ministry forever. Television could spread the message, but television alone wasn't enough, because reaching people was one thing, keeping them connected to the ministry was another. And Copeland had an answer: partnership. This wasn't simply about someone watching a sermon and moving on. The idea was to create a relationship between the viewer and the ministry. A person could become a partner, someone who prayed with the ministry, someone who received its teachings, someone who supported its work, and someone who believed they were participating in what the ministry was doing around the world. Kenneth Copeland Ministries still describes partnership as more than simply giving or sowing. It calls it a covenant, a joining together in faith and ministry. But the story of how Copeland discovered this idea is fascinating. It goes back to the years when he was working with Oral Roberts. According to Copeland's own account, he watched Roberts minister to his partners and became fascinated by the relationship between the ministry and the people supporting it. He wanted to become a partner himself. But there was a problem. He didn't have the money. Copeland has recalled that during one service, he wanted to commit to giving $10 a month to Roberts' ministry, but he didn't have the $10. So according to his account, he put a pencil in the offering envelope as a symbol of the money he intended to give. Then something happened that Copeland remembered for decades. A woman approached him after the service and said she believed she was supposed to give him $10. Copeland took the money, he went back to his offering envelope, and replaced the pencil with the $10. That story became part of the way Copeland later explained his understanding of partnership. And think about what he had just witnessed. Not simply a donation, a relationship. A person believed they were connecting themselves to a ministry. The ministry believed the partner was helping carry its mission. And Copeland saw enormous potential in that relationship. Then came another breakthrough: radio. In May 1975, Kenneth Copeland Ministries launched its radio ministry on just 10 stations. But according to the ministry's own history, within a year, the broadcast had expanded to more than 500 stations across the United States and Canada. That is an extraordinary jump. 10 stations. Then more than 500. And as the audience expanded, something else expanded with it: the production and distribution of ministry materials. KCM says cassette production rose from about 27,000 to 171,000 during that period. Now, the message wasn't confined to a church. It wasn't even confined to a television audience. It could travel through radio, through recordazines, through magazines, through books, through correspondence, and through the growing network of partners. Then came television. KCM says it aired its first one-hour weekly television broadcast in 1979, and that changed the equation again, because television could put Kenneth Copeland directly into someone's living room. The viewer could see his face, hear his voice, listen to his teaching, and then be invited deeper into the ministry. This was the beginning of something much larger than a preacher with a television show. It was becoming a communications network. And communications networks have one enormous advantage: scale. A preacher can stand before 500 people, but a television program can potentially reach hundreds of thousands. A radio broadcast can travel across state lines. A magazine can arrive in someone's mailbox. A letter can speak directly to a supporter, and a partner can remain connected to the ministry month after month. That meant Copeland didn't have to find a new audience every Sunday. He could build an audience that stayed, and that audience could grow. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because the ministry wasn't only broadcasting sermons, it was building an entire ecosystem around the message: teaching materials, books, magazines, television, radio, events, partner communications, and eventually a massive physical operation to support all of it. The ministry says its Believer's Voice of Victory magazine has been published for more than 4 decades. And today, the organization describes hundreds of thousands of people as covenant partners around the world. But the important thing isn't simply the number, it's the structure. Because every new medium created another doorway into the ministry. Someone could discover Copeland on television, then receive a magazine, then listen to a radio program, then attend an event, then become a partner, then continue receiving teachings. The audience wasn't just being reached, it was being connected. And connection creates something television ratings alone cannot create: loyalty. That loyalty became one of the most valuable assets in the entire operation. Because once people believed they weren't simply spectators, but partners in the mission, the relationship became personal. And that's exactly how Copeland Ministries describes it. The ministry says supporters become part of the team and help make its worldwide work possible. Now imagine what happens when that model operates for decades. One partner becomes thousands, thousands become tens of thousands, and eventually an international network. The ministry grows, the broadcasts grow, the properties grow, the staff grows, the equipment grows, the organization grows, and eventually the numbers become enormous. But there was a problem. The bigger the ministry became, the more expensive it became to operate. Broadcasting costs money, aircraft cost money, buildings cost money, land costs money, employees cost money, producing television costs money, and reaching millions of people costs money. So the question becomes, where does all that money go? And more importantly, what happens when a ministry becomes wealthy enough to own the kind of assets most ordinary churches could never afford? Because by the time Kenneth Copeland's empire had matured, it wasn't simply operating from a pulpit. It was operating from a massive physical headquarters. It had land, buildings, broadcasting facilities, and aircraft. And eventually, one piece of property in Texas would become one of the most recognizable symbols of the entire Copeland empire. A property sitting beside Eagle Mountain Lake, a residence so large, so luxurious, and so unusual for a religious leader that it would eventually become part of a national debate. And when you see what sits on that property, you finally begin to understand why people started asking, how much is Kenneth Copeland actually worth? Because the answer to that question leads us straight toward the $760 million number. And that's where this story gets serious. For decades, Kenneth Copeland had been preaching about prosperity, but eventually people began asking a different question. What does prosperity actually look like when the preacher himself becomes extraordinarily wealthy? To answer that question, you don't have to start with a bank account. You can start with a piece of land in Texas, because sitting beside Eagle Mountain Lake outside Fort Worth is a property that looks less like an ordinary church residence and more like something you'd expect to find behind the gates of a billionaire's estate. The house is enormous, more than 18,000 square feet, 6 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, a tennis court, a covered boat dock, and a lakefront setting. The Houston Chronicle reported in 2021 that the residence was appraised at approximately $7 million and was owned by Eagle Mountain International Church. But the size isn't even the most remarkable part. Senate Finance Committee reports cited by the Corps included a sweeping spiral staircase, a bridge crossing the living room, crystal chandeliers, and doors that Gloria Copeland came from a castle. This wasn't simply a large house. It had become a symbol, a physical representation of the prosperity message Kenneth Cope is preaching. And Copeland himself explained the house in spiritual terms. At a 2015 Believers Convention, he recalled what he described as a message from God concerning the home. It is part of your prosperity. That sentence tells you almost everything you need to understand about Copeland's worldview. To his critics, the mansion. To Copeland, it represented blessing. But then there's something even more interesting. The house wasn't sitting alone. Nearby was something most pastors don't have: an airport. Kenneth Copeland Airport. The airport and surrounding ministry properties sit on part of a roughly 1,400-acre tract associated with Eagle Mountain International Church, according to the Houston Chronicle's investigation. Think about that. A massive ministry property, a huge lakefront residence, and an airport. The Houston Chronicle reported that several aircraft associated with the church were valued at more than $19 million and received property tax exemptions after the church argued that the planes were important to its religious mission. One aircraft became particularly famous, a Gulfstream V. And this wasn't just any Gulfstream. It had previously belonged producer and actor Tyler Perry. Copeland's ministry acquired the aircraft in 2018. When it arrived, Copeland celebrated the purchase.
This is Friday, January the 12th, 2018. We took possession of the Gulfstream 5, and we give God praise for it and thanksgiving. It is debt-free.
This is a big deal, man. It's a big airplane. Hey, are you looking at this? Hey, are you seeing this?
But the story didn't end with buying the jet, because the aircraft was then upgraded, and the upgrade wasn't cheap. In 2020, Kenneth Copeland Ministries announced that the Gulfstream's interior had been completely reconfigured. The ministry said the work cost just under $2.2 million. And Copeland specifically thanked members of the Elite CX team whose pledges helped fund the project. Think about that for a second. A private Gulfstream, a multi-million-dollar interior renovation, and a ministry asking its Make the Aircraft project possible. This is where the story becomes fascinating, because the question isn't simply, why does a pastor have a private jet? The more important question is, why did Copeland believe the ministry needed one? And Copeland had an answer. He argued that commercial aviation would interfere with the amount of ministry work he could accomplish. In a later explanation of his private jet use, Copeland said that if he flew commercial, he would have to stop a large portion of what he was doing. His reasoning was practical. Commercial flights have schedules, security, passengers, delays, connections, waiting. A FIR's something completely different. Control. You choose the departure time, you choose the destination, you avoid the commercial terminal. And for someone who believes his schedule is part of a global ministry mission, that can be presented as a necessity rather than a luxury. But critics saw it differently. They questioned why donations to a religious ministry should support such expensive aircraft, and questioned whether every flight was truly ministry related. Those questions became serious enough to attract congressional attention. The U.S. Senate Finance Committee investigated several prominent televangelist ministries, including Copeland's. And the controversy wasn't limited to one aircraft.
You have how many planes?
We have the Gulfstream, and we still have our Citation team. And then we have a little small airplane.
There were disputes involving tax exemptions and questions about the financial information surrounding the ministry's aircraft and compensation. At one point, a church-owned Cessna 550 faced a tax exemption dispute after the ministry declined to provide certain salary information requested by the appraisal district. The church challenged the issue in court. Eventually, the dispute was settled. But the larger question remained. How much wealth was flowing through this ministry? No longer talking about one preacher receiving offerings. We're looking at land, buildings, a massive residence, an airport, multiple aircraft, broadcasting facilities, books, television, radio, and an international network of supporters. And suddenly, the $760 million number begins to look very different. Because when people hear $760 million, they often imagine one enormous personal bank account. But the real story is more complicated. The Houston Chronicle reported that the $760 million figure came from a 2018 BeliefNet estimate of Copeland's net worth. The same investigation also found that Copeland's church-controlled properties in Tarrant County alone included land, buildings, and personal property valued at nearly $60 million. So the number on the screen isn't simply a pile of cash sitting inside a vault. It's an estimate of wealth associated with Des building an enormous ministry organization. And that's precisely why the number became so controversial. Because if you want to understand the fortune, you can't just look at what Kenneth Copeland owns personally. You have to look at the entire ecosystem surrounding him. And that ecosystem is enormous. But there is one problem. We still haven't answered the most important question. Where did the money actually come from? Was it simply donations? Was it television, books, speaking, real estate, and natural gas mints, or something else? Because when Copeland was asked directly about his wealth in a 2019 interview, he didn't say that his fortune came from offerings alone. He pointed to something unexpected, natural gas on his property.
I'm a very wealthy man.
You're a very wealthy man.
Yes.
Yeah.
My wealth doesn't come from offerings alone.
Because you sell things, books and DVDs.
Yes, and I have a lot of natural gas on our property. Didn't know that, did you, babe?
Now I do.
Yeah, you do. Isn't that wonderful?
Well, I guess.
Some people saw these things as evidence of prosperity. Others saw them as excessive leader. The debate became so serious that Copeland's ministry attracted scrutiny from journalists, watchdog organizations, and the U.S. Senate Finance Committee. But Kenneth Copeland never appeared to hide from the idea of wealth. Quite the opposite. So perhaps the most important lesson from this entire story is this. The $760 million isn't the story by itself. Message became a movement. How a movement became a media organization. How that organization accumulated assets, and how after decades of growth, one pastor became associated with one of the largest fortunes ever attributed to an American religious leader. Whether you see Kenneth Copeland as a man who successfully built a worldwide ministry or as a symbol of everything controversial about the prosperity gospel, one fact is difficult to ignore. He built something enormous, and it started with almost nothing compared with what came later. A musician, a pilot, a preacher, a television broadcast, a handful of believers, and an idea that faith and prosperity could go together. Decades later, that idea had reached millions, and the man who preached it had become associated with a fortune estimated at $760 million. So the real mystery was never simply, where is Kenneth Copeland's $760 million? The deeper question was, how does one man's message become powerful enough to build an empire? And perhaps that is the most extraordinary part of the story, because behind every mansion, every aircraft, every television broadcast, and every dollar, there was first a message. And Kenneth Copeland spent more than half a century making sure the world heard it. This was the story of Kenneth Copeland.